After 15 years of being told I was too difficult for family gatherings, my daughter and son-in-law had the audacity to show up at my penthouse begging for money. They had no idea I'd been recording every cruel word they'd said about me over the years. The look on their faces when my lawyer played back their own voices in court was worth every lonely holiday I'd endured. Follow my story until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this reaches. At 70, I thought I understood what family loyalty meant. My name is Magdalena Hawthorne, and for 4 decades I had poured my heart, soul, and every waking moment into building Hawthorne Estates, a luxury real estate empire that spanned from the vineyards of Napa Valley to the coastal properties of Big Sur. My corner penthouse on the 42nd floor of the Millennium Tower in downtown San Francisco had been my sanctuary and my reward. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz Island gleaming in the distance, and the rolling fog that painted the bay in shades of silver and gold each morning. The penthouse wasn't just a home, it was a testament to what a woman could build when she refused to accept limitations. Every marble surface, every piece of custom furniture, every carefully curated art piece told the story of someone who had started with nothing and created something magnificent. The baccarat crystal chandelier in the foyer had been my gift to myself when Hawthorne Estates hit its first $100 million year. The Italian leather seating arrangement facing the windows was where I'd conducted some of my most important negotiations, the city sprawling below us as I closed deals that would shape San Francisco's skyline for decades. I hadn't inherited this life, I had built it. Brick by brick, contract by contract, through 18-hour days and sleepless nights when others were home with their families. While other women my age had been attending PTA meetings and soccer games, I had been transforming abandoned warehouses into luxury condominiums, turning neglected neighborhoods into sought-after addresses, and creating homes for thousands of families across Northern California. The irony that haunted my quiet evenings was profound. I had spent my life creating beautiful homes for strangers, while struggling to maintain a place in my own family's heart. My daughter Cordelia had always been my greatest source of pride and my deepest source of heartache. Even as a child, she had possessed an ethereal beauty and a sharp intelligence that reminded me of myself at her age. But where I had channeled my intensity into building something lasting, Cordelia had directed hers toward perfection. Perfect grades, perfect appearance, perfect social connections, and eventually what she considered the perfect marriage. I had raised Cordelia largely alone after her father, my college sweetheart Marcus, died in a car accident when she was only 12. Marcus had been the gentle balance to my ambitious drive, the one who reminded me to slow down and notice the small moments. His death had left both Cordelia and me adrift, each of us grieving in our own way, while trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life. Perhaps that's where I made my first mistake. Drowning in grief and overwhelmed by single parenthood, I had thrown myself even deeper into my work. Hawthorne Estates became not just my career, but my escape, my way of avoiding the empty spaces in our house where Marcus's laughter used to echo. I told myself I was securing Cordelia's future, building something that would give her every opportunity I'd never had. But Cordelia saw only a mother who was physically present but emotionally unavailable, who could negotiate million-dollar deals but struggled to help with algebra homework without checking her phone. By the time I realized my mistake, Cordelia was already 17 and had learned to navigate life without expecting much emotional support from me. She was polite, accomplished, and increasingly distant. The perfect daughter on paper, but someone who felt more like a sophisticated roommate than my child. When Cordelia announced her engagement to Nathaniel Pemberton III at 26, I was genuinely thrilled. Nathaniel came from one of San Francisco's oldest families. His great-grandfather had made a fortune in shipping and railroads in the 1800s, and the Pemberton name was synonymous with philanthropy, culture, and old money elegance. More importantly, he seemed to worship Cordelia in a way that reminded me of how Marcus had looked at me in our early years. Nathaniel was everything I had hoped for in a son-in-law. Harvard educated, articulate, professionally successful as a portfolio manager for high net worth clients, and genuinely kind to me during our initial interactions. He asked thoughtful questions about my business, expressed admiration for what I had built, and seemed to understand the demands and rewards of building wealth from nothing. Their wedding was a masterpiece of San Francisco society. 300 guests at the St. Francis Hotel with a reception that showcased the best of everything the city had to offer. I had insisted on paying for the entire celebration, partly because I could afford it, and partly because I wanted to give Cordelia the fairy tale wedding she had dreamed about since childhood. The event made the society pages of the Chronicle, with photographs of the bride looking radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown and the groom beaming beside her as they danced beneath chandeliers that cast rainbow light across the ballroom. For the first few years of their marriage, we maintained what I thought was a warm and loving family relationship. I helped them purchase their first home in Pacific Heights, a stunning Victorian with bay windows and original hardwood floors that required substantial renovation. I contributed generously to the restoration, connecting them with the best architects and contractors from my network. When they mentioned wanting to travel to Europe for their first anniversary, I surprised them with first-class tickets and a month-long itinerary that included private tours of art museums and stays at five-star hotels. I thought I was being a generous mother and mother-in-law. I thought I was finally using my success to build the kind of close family relationships that had eluded me when Cordelia was younger. I thought money could bridge the gap that my emotional unavailability had created. But I was beginning to learn that money, while it could solve many problems, could also create new and more complex ones. When Cordelia and Nathaniel's twins were born, my grandchildren, Aurora and Sebastian, I fell in love with them instantly and completely. Holding those tiny, perfect babies in my arms awakened something in me that I hadn't felt since Cordelia was small. Here was my chance to be the grandmother I hadn't known how to be as a young mother, to shower them with the attention and affection that I had been too driven and too grief-stricken to give their mother. Aurora inherited Cordelia's ethereal beauty, with pale blonde hair and enormous blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with serious concentration. Sebastian was darker, more intense, with Marcus's thick brown hair and my own stubborn chin. From their earliest weeks, they had distinct personalities. Aurora was quiet and observant, content to watch the world from her stroller, while Sebastian was constantly in motion, reaching for everything within his grasp and voicing his opinions about the world with impressive volume. I threw myself into grandmotherhood with the same passion I had brought to building my business empire. I converted one of the guest bedrooms in my penthouse into a nursery, complete with custom-made cribs, a changing station stocked with every possible necessity, and shelves lined with books, toys, and educational materials. I hired a baby-proofing specialist to ensure every corner of my home was safe for curious toddlers. On weekends, Cordelia would bring the twins to visit me, and those Saturday afternoons became the highlight of my week. I would spend hours on the floor playing with blocks, reading stories, and watching their faces light up as they discovered new toys or games. Aurora loved when I sang old lullabies that I remembered from my own childhood, while Sebastian was fascinated by the elevators and would beg me to ride up and down the building just to push the buttons. For their first Christmas, I had commissioned a local artist to create a hand-painted mural on one wall of the Penthouse nursery, a whimsical scene of the San Francisco skyline populated with friendly dragons, flying cable cars, and a smiling Golden Gate Bridge. The twins would stand in front of that mural for long stretches, pointing at different details and asking me to tell them stories about the magical city where Grandma Maggie lived. Those were perhaps the happiest months of my adult life. After decades of defining myself entirely through professional achievement, I was discovering the profound joy of unconditional love. Aurora and Sebastian didn't care about my net worth or my business acumen. They just wanted stories, hugs, and someone who had infinite patience for their questions and explorations. But as the twins approached their third birthday, I began noticing subtle changes in Cordelia's behavior toward me. She became more critical of my parenting techniques during their visits, more controlling about their activities, and more quick to find fault with things that had never bothered her before. Mom, you really shouldn't let them jump on the furniture. They're going to think they can do that at home, and our furniture isn't built for that kind of treatment. Mom, they don't need a toy every time they visit. You're going to spoil them and make them think they should get presents constantly. Mom, that snack has too much sugar. We're trying to establish healthy eating habits, and you're undermining that when you give them cookies and ice cream. Each criticism felt like a small knife wound, especially because I couldn't understand what had changed. I was following the same routines we had established when the twins were younger, giving them the same level of attention and affection that had seemed to delight everyone just months earlier. When I asked Cordelia directly if I had done something to upset her, her response was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive deflection. It's not about you, Mom. It's about consistency and boundaries. Children need structure, and when every rule is different at different places, it confuses them. But I could see something else in her eyes, a resentment that seemed disproportionate to any grandparenting mistakes I might have made. It was the same look she had given me as a teenager when she felt I was paying more attention to work than to her life. But now, ironically, I was paying total attention to her children, and that somehow was also wrong. The first holiday exclusion came in November 2009, just weeks before the twins' third birthday. Cordelia called me on a Tuesday evening when I was reviewing contracts in my home office, the city lights twinkling below as I worked late into the night.
I was genuinely pleased by the news. Cordelia had never expressed interest in cooking elaborate meals, and I thought this might be a sign that she was growing into her role as a family matriarch. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. What can I bring? Should I pick up the wine, or would you prefer I handle the appetizers? There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. Actually, Mom, we were thinking this might be a good year to start some new traditions. Just our nuclear family. Nathaniel's parents are going to be in Italy, and we thought it would be nice to have a quiet, intimate celebration with just the four of us. The words hit me like a physical blow. Nuclear family? Just the four of us? I wasn't part of their nuclear family. After 3 years of weekend visits and bedtime stories and custom-painted murals, I was being categorized as extended family, an optional addition to their lives rather than an essential part. Cordelia, I don't understand. We've always spent holidays together. The twins are expecting to come to Grandma's house for Thanksgiving. Aurora has been talking about it for weeks. They're young, Mom. They'll adjust. And honestly, we think it might be healthier for them to understand that holidays are primarily about immediate family, not about managing extended family obligations. Extended family obligations? The phrase landed like a slap. After building a fortune that would secure their children's futures, after paying for their wedding and their house and countless other expenses, after pouring my love into those grandchildren with an intensity that had surprised even me, I had become an obligation. Cordelia, I don't understand. We've always spent holidays together. The twins are expecting to come to Grandma's house for Thanksgiving. Aurora has been talking about it for weeks. They're young, Mom. They'll adjust. And honestly, we think it might be healthier for them to understand that holidays are primarily about immediate family, not about managing extended family obligations. That Thanksgiving, I sat alone in my penthouse with catering from one of San Francisco's finest restaurants, watching the fog roll in over the bay while trying not to think about Aurora and Sebastian asking where Grandma Maggie was. I had built an empire, accumulated wealth that most people could only dream of, and created a home that was featured in architectural magazines. But I spent the holiday eating gourmet turkey by myself while my family celebrated without me, 20 minutes away. Christmas followed the same pattern. Cordelia explained that they wanted to focus on Santa magic and that having additional adults present would complicate the morning routine for the children. When I suggested joining them for Christmas dinner instead of Christmas morning, she had another excuse ready. They're planning a quiet day with no visitors, just the four of them enjoying their new toys and games. By New Year's Eve, I was beginning to understand that this wasn't about creating new family traditions or managing logistics. This was about systematically removing me from their lives while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. The pattern that emerged over the following months was both subtle and devastating. Birthday parties for the twins that I learned about only through social media posts showing elaborate celebrations with dozens of other families, Easter egg hunts in their backyard that I discovered had happened when Aurora mentioned finding the golden egg that Mummy hid behind the roses during one of our increasingly infrequent visits. 4th of July barbecues that were supposedly just a few close friends, but that Facebook photos revealed to be substantial gatherings with extended family from Nathaniel's side. When I confronted Cordelia about the pattern of exclusions, her response revealed both the depth of her resentment and the calculated nature of what she was doing to me. Mom, you have to understand that your presence changes the entire dynamic of every gathering. You can't help yourself. You take over everything. You rearrange the furniture to optimize traffic flow. You suggest improvements to how we're preparing food. You buy extravagant gifts that make everyone else's contributions look cheap. Every event becomes about you and your standards instead of about us and our friends. I was stunned by the accusation. Cordelia, I've never tried to take over anything. I offer to help because I want to contribute. But that's exactly the problem. You don't just contribute, you dominate. When you walk into a room, everyone starts deferring to your opinions because you're successful and wealthy and used to being in charge. Our friends feel intimidated, and Nathaniel feels like he's being judged as inadequate compared to your accomplishments. The words cut deep because they contained just enough truth to make me question my own behavior. Had I been unconsciously critical? Had my attempts to be helpful actually been expressions of controlling behavior that I hadn't recognized? If I've been overstepping, I can change that, I offered desperately. I just want to be part of the family. I want to watch Aurora and Sebastian grow up. Cordelia's response was delivered with a coldness that I had never heard from her before. Mom, maybe the problem is that you've spent so long being the CEO of everything that you don't know how to be just a grandmother. We don't need you to manage our holidays or improve our entertaining. We need you to sit quietly and let other people be in charge for once in your life. The ultimatum was clear. I could be part of their family if I was willing to diminish myself, to suppress the competence and leadership skills that had built their financial security, to become a passive observer in my own grandchildren's lives. I was being asked to choose between being myself and being included in their celebrations. When I couldn't promise to become less than who I was, when I couldn't agree to hide the very qualities that had made me successful enough to support their lifestyle, the invitations stopped coming altogether. The final conversation that sealed my fate came in April 2010, nearly 6 months into the pattern of systematic exclusion. I had called to ask about plans for the twins' 4th birthday party, hoping that enough time had passed for us to find some kind of compromise. Mom, I think we need to establish some clear boundaries, Cordelia said, her voice carrying the kind of firm finality that I recognized from my own most difficult business negotiations. These constant discussions about holiday plans are creating stress and tension for everyone involved. Nathaniel and I have decided that we need to focus on our immediate family for major celebrations and special occasions. Cordelia! Please don't shut me out of their lives. Aurora and Sebastian are my only grandchildren. I've already missed so many important moments. You haven't missed anything important. You see them every few weeks for visits. That's more than some grandparents get. The casual dismissal of my pain was breathtaking. Those supervised visits feel more like parole check-ins than family time. I want to be part of their real lives, not just an hour on Saturday afternoons when you have nothing better to do.
That's exactly the kind of dramatic, guilt-inducing response that makes these conversations so difficult, Cordelia replied. We're not punishing you, Mom. We're protecting our family dynamic from unnecessary complications. Unnecessary complications. That's what I had become, an inconvenient element that disrupted their perfect family narrative. Over the following 15 years, I saw Aurora and Sebastian perhaps 20 times total, and each encounter felt more stilted and artificial than the last. Cordelia would bring them to my penthouse for exactly 90 minutes, usually on a Saturday afternoon, with a detailed list of rules about what we could and couldn't do together. No taking them anywhere without Cordelia present, even to the building's garden or the lobby. No buying them gifts without prior approval from their parents. No discussing my business success or travel adventures that might make them think their parents' lifestyle wasn't sufficient. No questions about school, friends, or activities that might reveal how little I knew about their daily lives. No references to holidays or special occasions that might make them wonder why Grandma wasn't invited to family celebrations. I watched Aurora grow from a curious, affectionate toddler into a polite but distant teenager who called me Mrs. Hawthorne instead of Grandma Maggie, and who seemed genuinely confused about what role I was supposed to play in her life. Sebastian developed from an exuberant little boy who used to beg for piggyback rides into a young man who checked his phone constantly during our visits and answered my questions with polite monosyllables. By their 15th birthday party, a milestone celebration that I learned about through a mutual acquaintance rather than from Cordelia herself, Aurora and Sebastian had become strangers to me. They were intelligent, accomplished young people with no real understanding of who their grandmother was beyond the carefully curated narrative that portrayed me as a successful but difficult woman who required careful management in small doses. But while Cordelia thought she was successfully protecting her family from my supposedly disruptive influence, she had no idea that I had been documenting everything. Every cruel comment about my controlling behavior, every dismissive remark about my need for attention, every conversation where she and Nathaniel discussed their plans for eventually inheriting my wealth while simultaneously treating me like a toxic presence that had to be managed and contained. The penthouse had excellent acoustics, and my security system included audio recording capabilities that captured every conversation that took place in common areas. Over 15 years, I had accumulated hundreds of hours of recordings that revealed the true nature of Cordelia and Nathaniel's feelings toward me and their long-term financial expectations. I heard Cordelia explaining to friends that she was managing a difficult relationship with my mother while simultaneously planning elaborate vacations funded by money I had given them. I heard Nathaniel complaining to his business associates that I was emotionally manipulative while discussing investment strategies for the inheritance he expected to receive. I heard them both laughing about my desperate attempts to buy love while calculating how much their children's college funds would be worth when combined with their eventual inheritance. The recordings painted a picture of two people who viewed me not as a beloved family member, but as a necessary evil, someone whose money they needed, but whose presence they found burdensome, and whose emotions they considered irrelevant to their decision-making processes.
For 15 years, I had been characterized as the problem, the difficult family member who had to be excluded for everyone else's peace and happiness. But I had evidence of who was really creating the family dysfunction, and I had been waiting patiently for the right moment to use that evidence. The moment finally came on a foggy Saturday morning in March 2025, when my doorman called to announce that Cordelia and Nathaniel were in the lobby asking to come up. They hadn't visited in over 8 months, and they certainly hadn't been invited. But they were here, and something about the urgency in the doorman's voice suggested that this wasn't a social call. As I waited for the elevator to bring them to my floor, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. After 15 years of exclusion and manipulation, my daughter and son-in-law were finally coming to me for help. But they had no idea that the grandmother they had dismissed as irrelevant had been preparing for this moment for over a decade. The woman they thought they could control and manipulate was about to remind them that successful business people don't just disappear quietly when they're pushed aside. We fight back. We document everything. And we win. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 42nd floor, and I heard the familiar sound of my private entrance door opening. But something was different this time. Instead of the confident footsteps I remembered from Cordelia's previous visits, I heard hesitant shuffling, whispered conversations, and what sounded like nervous throat clearing. After 15 years of being treated like an inconvenient obligation, my daughter and son-in-law were finally coming to see me voluntarily, and they sounded terrified. "Mom?" Cordelia's voice carried down the marble-floored hallway, uncertain and strangely childlike. "Are you home?" I took a moment to compose myself, smoothing down my silk blouse and checking my reflection in the antique mirror that hung near my living room entrance. At 70, I had maintained the kind of understated elegance that came from decades of success. Silver hair cut in a sleek bob, minimal but expensive jewelry, and the kind of posture that commanded respect in any boardroom. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a woman who had built an empire and wasn't easily intimidated or manipulated. "I'm in the living room," I called back, settling into my favorite armchair, a custom piece positioned to take advantage of both the spectacular bay view and the strategic psychological advantage of having visitors approach me, rather than meeting them halfway. What I saw when Cordelia and Nathaniel entered my living room shocked me more than I had expected. The confident, polished couple who had systematically excluded me from their lives looked like shadows of their former selves. Cordelia, who had always prided herself on looking like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, appeared haggard and thin. Her designer clothes hung loose on her frame, her usually perfect makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she clutched her handbag. Nathaniel looked even worse. The man who had once carried himself with the easy confidence of old money and professional success now had the hunched shoulders and darting eyes of someone under enormous stress. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually immaculate hair was disheveled, and he kept glancing around my penthouse as if he was cataloging assets rather than admiring the decor. "Hello, Mother," Cordelia said, her voice artificially bright in a way that immediately put me on guard. She hadn't called me Mother in over a decade. It was usually Mom during our brief, supervised visits, and more often simply avoided addressing me directly at all. "Cordelia, Nathaniel," I kept my voice neutral and didn't rise from my chair. "This is unexpected. You didn't call ahead." "We were in the neighborhood," Nathaniel said quickly, which was obviously a lie since their house in Pacific Heights was nowhere near downtown. "We thought it might be nice to catch up." Catch up, as if we were casual acquaintances who had lost touch rather than family members who had been systematically estranged for 15 years. "Please sit down." I gestured toward the sofa facing my chair. As they settled themselves awkwardly on the Italian leather cushions, I noticed they were sitting closer together than usual, presenting a united front that suggested they had rehearsed this visit extensively. "How are Aurora and Sebastian?" I asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to see how they would handle questions about the grandchildren they had worked so hard to keep away from me. Cordelia's face brightened with what appeared to be genuine pride. "They're wonderful. Aurora just got accepted to Stanford for early admission. She's planning to study international relations. And Sebastian is the captain of his debate team. They're both doing so well." 18 years old. My grandchildren were 18 years old, on the verge of college, and I had missed virtually their entire childhood. I had missed school plays and science fairs and graduation ceremonies. I had missed teaching them to drive and helping them with college applications and celebrating their achievements. 15 years of memories that should have been mine had been stolen from me by the two people sitting nervously in my living room. "That's wonderful," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the pain that threatened to overwhelm me. I would have loved to celebrate these milestones with them.
The comment hung in the air like an accusation. Cordelia shifted uncomfortably and exchanged a quick glance with Nathaniel.
Well, that's actually part of what we wanted to talk to you about, Nathaniel said, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone delivering a prepared speech. We've been thinking that maybe we've been too protective. Maybe it's time for Aurora and Sebastian to have more of a relationship with their grandmother. After 18 years of systematic exclusion, they were suddenly interested in family reconciliation. The timing was suspicious enough to set off every instinct I had developed during 4 decades of business negotiations. When someone who has been hostile suddenly becomes conciliatory, they usually want something. What's changed? I asked directly. For 15 years, you've told me that my presence was disruptive to your family dynamic. Now you're suggesting that wasn't true? Cordelia flinched at the bluntness of the question. It's not that it wasn't true then, it's just that circumstances change. The kids are older now. They can handle more complex family relationships. And what else has changed? I pressed, because this sudden interest in family reconciliation seems rather convenient. Another exchange of glances between them. They were definitely working from a script, and I had just asked a question they hadn't fully prepared for. Mom, why does something have to have changed? Can't we just want to rebuild our relationship? But Nathaniel was less skilled at deception than his wife, and his words revealed more than he probably intended. The truth is, Magdalena, we've been doing some estate planning recently, and it made us realize how important family connections are, especially as we all get older. Estate planning. There it was. They weren't here because they had suddenly discovered the value of family relationships. They were here because they had been forced to confront their own mortality and financial future, and they needed to secure their access to my inheritance. I see, I said calmly. And what kind of estate planning have you been doing? Nothing dramatic, Nathaniel said quickly, but his hands were fidgeting with his wedding ring in a way that suggested high anxiety. Just the usual stuff, updating wills, reviewing life insurance policies, making sure everything is in order for the kids' future. And what did you discover during this estate planning that made you realize you needed to rebuild relationships with me? The question was direct enough that they couldn't deflect it without seeming evasive. Cordelia took a deep breath and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed explanation. Mom, we realized that we may have been short-sighted about family dynamics. Aurora and Sebastian are going to need all the family support they can get as they start their adult lives. College is expensive, and they have dreams and ambitions that will require financial backing. We want to make sure they have every possible advantage and opportunity. Translation: they had calculated the cost of their children's futures and realized they couldn't afford it without access to my money. And you think reconnecting with me will provide those advantages? We think having a relationship with their grandmother would be valuable for them in many ways. Financial security is just one aspect of what family provides. But his emphasis on financial security told me everything I needed to know about their true priorities. Tell me about Aurora and Sebastian's college plans, I said, changing the subject to see how much financial information they would reveal. Cordelia launched into an enthusiastic description of their children's academic achievements and future aspirations. Aurora wanted to study international relations at Stanford and then pursue a graduate degree in diplomatic studies. Sebastian was interested in environmental engineering and was looking at MIT, Caltech, and UC Berkeley. Both children were exceptional students with expensive dreams and ambitious career goals. As Cordelia talked, I did some quick mental math. Stanford tuition and expenses currently ran about $80,000 per year. MIT was similarly expensive. If both children pursued graduate degrees as well, the total cost of their education could easily exceed $500,000. That was a substantial financial burden for a family that, despite their outward appearances of wealth, had always lived beyond their means. I see, I said, when Cordelia finished her recitation.
Those are impressive schools and expensive ones. How are you planning to fund their educations? We've been saving, Nathaniel said defensively. We've had college funds for them since they were born. And those funds will cover 4 years at Stanford and MIT plus graduate school? Another uncomfortable exchange of glances. We'll make it work, Cordelia said. We always do. But something in her voice suggested that making it work was going to be more challenging than she wanted to admit. What about your business, Nathaniel? How is the portfolio management firm doing? Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The market has been challenging recently, a lot of volatility, but that's normal in our industry. We weather the storms.
I had built a fortune by reading people and situations accurately, and Nathaniel was exhibiting all the signs of someone under severe financial pressure. The slightly too quick responses, the defensive body language, the reluctance to provide specific details about his business performance. These were classic indicators of someone whose professional life was not going as well as he wanted others to believe. And your house? Are you still in Pacific Heights? Of course, Cordelia said quickly. We love that house. We've put so much work into it over the years. But Nathaniel's expressions suggested that their attachment to the house might be more complicated than love. When someone is facing financial difficulties, real estate often becomes a source of stress rather than comfort. I decided to probe a little deeper. I drive through Pacific Heights occasionally, and I've noticed that real estate values have been fluctuating quite a bit recently. Some of those beautiful Victorian homes have been sitting on the market for months. The market always has cycles, Nathaniel said dismissively. We're not concerned about short-term fluctuations. But his response was too quick and too defensive to be entirely truthful. As the conversation continued, I began to piece together a picture of a family that was facing significant financial pressure while trying to maintain the appearance of continued prosperity. Aurora and Sebastian's expensive educational aspirations, combined with what appeared to be challenges in Nathaniel's business, had created a gap between their resources and their obligations that they couldn't bridge without external help. And the most obvious source of that external help was sitting across from them in a penthouse worth more than most people made in a lifetime. "Mom," Cordelia said, her voice taking on the wheedling tone I remembered from her teenage years when she wanted something expensive. "We were wondering if you might like to contribute to Aurora and Sebastian's college funds. Not as a loan or anything formal like that, but as a grandmother who wants to invest in her grandchildren's futures." There it was, the real reason for this unexpected visit, delivered with just enough emotional manipulation to make it sound like they were doing me a favor by allowing me to give them money. "How much were you thinking?" I asked calmly. "Well," Nathaniel said, launching into what was clearly a prepared presentation, "we estimate that between both children, we're looking at about $600,000 for undergraduate and graduate degrees. We've saved about $200,000 already, so we're short about $400,000. $400,000. They were asking me for $400,000 after 15 years of treating me like I was too toxic to attend their holiday celebrations. "And you think I should provide this money because they're your grandmother," Cordelia said, as if the relationship she had worked so hard to undermine was suddenly the most important thing in the world. "Because you love them and want them to succeed." The manipulation was breathtaking in its transparency. For 15 years, they had argued that my love for Aurora and Sebastian was possessive and inappropriate, that my desire to be involved in their lives was disruptive and controlling. Now suddenly, that same love was being presented as justification for a massive financial contribution. "And what would this contribution buy me in terms of our family relationship?" I asked. We told you, we want to rebuild family connections. Aurora and Sebastian are going to be adults soon, and they should have the opportunity to know their grandmother properly. Define properly. Well, maybe we could start having regular dinners, maybe once a month or so. And of course, you'd be welcome at their graduation ceremonies and major milestones. Once a month. After 18 years of virtual exclusion, they were offering me access to my grandchildren once a month under carefully controlled circumstances in exchange for $400,000. The offer was so outrageously exploitative that I had to admire their audacity, even as I felt a familiar rage building in my chest. I'll need to think about this, I said carefully. Of course, Nathaniel said quickly. We wouldn't expect an immediate answer to such a significant request. But Aurora needs to make her final decision about Stanford within the next few weeks. So if you're going to help with her tuition, we'd need to know relatively soon. The artificial deadline was another classic manipulation tactic. Create urgency to prevent the target from thinking too carefully about the proposal. How soon? I asked. Maybe by the end of next week, Cordelia suggested. That would give us time to finalize her enrollment and housing arrangements. 1 week. They were giving me 1 week to decide whether to pay $400,000 for the privilege of seeing my grandchildren once a month.
I understand, I said, rising from my chair to signal that the meeting was over. I'll give this careful consideration and let you know my decision. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Cordelia made one final attempt at emotional manipulation. Mom, I know we haven't been as close as we could have been over the years, but this could be a new beginning for our family. Aurora and Sebastian deserve to know what an accomplished, successful woman their grandmother is. The irony was stunning. For 15 years, my accomplishments and success had been presented as evidence that I was too controlling and domineering to be around their children. Now, suddenly, those same qualities were being marketed as valuable influences that Aurora and Sebastian deserved to experience. After they left, I sat in my living room watching the fog roll in over the Golden Gate Bridge and thinking about the conversation I had just witnessed. Cordelia and Nathaniel were clearly in financial trouble, though they were working hard to hide the extent of their problems. Their children's educational expenses had created a crisis that threatened their carefully maintained lifestyle, and they had decided that the solution was to exploit the grandmother they had spent 15 years marginalizing. But what they didn't know was that I had been recording our entire conversation, just as I had been recording every interaction we'd had in my penthouse for the past decade. Their request for money, their conditional offer of family access, their casual dismissal of 15 years of exclusion, it was all captured in digital clarity. More importantly, their visit had confirmed something I had long suspected. Their treatment of me hadn't been based on genuine concerns about my behavior or its impact on their children. It had been about control, about maintaining their position as the sole authorities in Aurora and Sebastian's lives, and about managing their access to my wealth according to their timeline and preferences. They had spent 15 years training Aurora and Sebastian to see me as a peripheral figure in their lives, someone who could be included or excluded based on their parents' convenience. Now that they needed money, they expected to be able to reverse that conditioning instantly, transforming me from an inconvenient obligation back into a beloved grandmother whose generosity they could exploit. But successful business people don't survive 40 decades in competitive industries by allowing themselves to be manipulated by transparent schemes, even when those schemes are orchestrated by their own children. I had a week to give them my answer, but I already knew what that answer would be, and I knew it would be delivered in a way they would never forget.
The woman they had dismissed as too difficult for family gatherings was about to show them exactly how difficult she could be when she was properly motivated. Over the next few days, I began implementing a plan that I had been developing for years, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. I called my attorney, Patricia Morrison, who specialized in family law and estate planning. Patricia had been handling my legal affairs for a decade, and she was familiar with the complex dynamics of my relationship with Cordelia and Nathaniel. They're asking for $400,000 in exchange for limited access to grandchildren they've kept away from you for 15 years? Patricia asked after I described the meeting. That's not family reconciliation, that's extortion. That's exactly what I thought. And I have the entire conversation recorded. Good. We're going to need that recording, along with any others you have that document their treatment of you over the years. Patricia explained that what Cordelia and Nathaniel were doing constituted a form of grandparent alienation that had legal implications, especially when combined with financial exploitation. The recordings I had accumulated over the years would provide crucial evidence of their systematic efforts to damage my relationship with Aurora and Sebastian, while simultaneously planning to exploit my wealth according to their timeline and preferences. While Patricia began preparing legal documents, I started my own investigation into the true extent of Cordelia and Nathaniel's financial situation. If they were desperate enough to attempt this kind of manipulation, their problems were likely much worse than they had admitted. What I discovered over the next few days was both shocking and entirely predictable. Nathaniel's portfolio management firm was hemorrhaging clients due to poor investment performance and what appeared to be questionable business practices. Several of his largest clients had filed complaints with financial regulatory agencies alleging mismanagement of their funds and excessive fees for poor returns.
Cordelia and Nathaniel's house in Pacific Heights, which they claimed to love so much, was actually in pre-foreclosure proceedings. They were 4 months behind on their mortgage payments, and the bank had initiated the legal process to reclaim the property. Their lifestyle of private schools, luxury vacations, and expensive social activities had been financed through home equity loans and credit cards that they could no longer service. Most disturbing of all, I discovered that they had been using Aurora and Sebastian as collateral for their financial schemes. They had taken out life insurance policies on both children and had been borrowing against those policies to fund their lifestyle. They had also opened credit cards in the children's names, damaging their credit before they were even adults. The picture that emerged was of two people who had spent years living far beyond their means while systematically destroying not only their own financial future, but their children's as well. Aurora and Sebastian's college fund, which Nathaniel claimed totaled $200,000, actually contained less than $50,000 after years of withdrawals to cover other expenses. When I called Patricia to share these discoveries, her reaction was immediate and decisive. Mrs. Hawthorne, this goes far beyond family drama. What they've done to those children's credit and finances constitutes fraud, and their attempt to manipulate you into providing money while hiding their true financial situation could be considered elder financial abuse. Elder financial abuse. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, not because it wasn't accurate, but because it was. At 70, despite my wealth and business success, I was being targeted for financial exploitation by my own daughter and son-in-law, who were counting on my emotional attachment to my grandchildren to override my business judgment. Patricia, I want to file charges, I said, not just to protect myself, but to protect Aurora and Sebastian from parents who are willing to destroy their financial futures to maintain their own lifestyle. Are you prepared for the consequences? Patricia asked gently. Filing charges will likely mean the complete end of any relationship with Cordelia and Nathaniel, and possibly with your grandchildren as well, at least until they're old enough to understand the truth. I thought about Aurora and Sebastian, 18 years old and on the verge of adulthood, unaware that their parents had been systematically damaging their financial futures while keeping them away from a grandmother who could have helped guide and support them through their formative years. Patricia, those children deserve to know the truth about why their grandmother was absent from their lives, and they deserve to be protected from parents who are willing to commit fraud in their names. If that means sacrificing what little relationship I have left with Cordelia, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. The decision felt both devastating and liberating. For 15 years, I had endured exclusion and manipulation because I was afraid of losing what little access I had to my grandchildren. Now I was choosing to risk everything in the hope of ultimately saving Aurora and Sebastian from the consequences of their parents' destructive choices. As I sat in my penthouse that evening, watching the city lights twinkle across the bay, I thought about the phone call I would make to Cordelia in 2 days to give her my answer to their request. They had no idea that their desperate gambit had triggered an investigation that would expose years of deception and financial fraud. The grandmother they had dismissed as irrelevant was about to show them that some battles are worth fighting, even when the cost is higher than anyone wants to pay. The woman who had built an empire from nothing was about to demonstrate that she hadn't forgotten how to fight for what mattered most, even if what mattered most was the truth that would set her grandchildren free from the lies that had shaped their entire lives. My answer to their request was ready, and it was going to change everything. The morning after my meeting with Patricia Morrison, I sat in my home office with the San Francisco skyline stretching before me, surrounded by 15 years worth of carefully organized documentation. Bank statements, recordings, photographs, and email printouts covered every surface of my mahogany desk. What had started as a defensive measure to protect myself from Cordelia and Nathaniel's manipulation had evolved into something far more comprehensive, a complete record of their systematic deception and financial fraud. My first call was to Marcus Chen, a forensic accountant I had worked with during several complex business acquisitions over the years. Marcus specialized in uncovering hidden assets, fraudulent financial reporting, and the kind of creative accounting that people used when they were trying to hide the true extent of their financial problems. If anyone could piece together the full scope of Cordelia and Nathaniel's situation, it would be Marcus. Mrs. Hawthorne, investigating your own family members is going to be emotionally difficult. Are you prepared for what we might discover? Marcus, I've already discovered that my daughter and son-in-law have been systematically excluding me from my grandchildren's lives while planning to exploit my wealth. I don't think anything else they've done could surprise me at this point. I was wrong. Marcus's investigation, conducted over the following 72 hours, revealed a level of financial deception and family betrayal that went far beyond what I had imagined possible. Using his network of contacts in banking, credit agencies, and public records, Marcus assembled a comprehensive picture of Cordelia and Nathaniel's true financial situation that was both shocking and heartbreaking. The Pacific Heights house that they claimed to love so much wasn't just in pre-foreclosure. It had been refinanced 4 times in the past 8 years, each time extracting more equity to fund their increasingly expensive lifestyle. The current mortgage balance was actually higher than the home's current market value, meaning they were underwater on a property they had originally purchased with my help 15 years earlier. Nathaniel's portfolio management firm, Pemberton Wealth Advisors, was under investigation by both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the California Department of Financial Protection for what appeared to be a classic Ponzi scheme. He had been using new client investments to pay returns to existing clients, while siphoning substantial amounts for his own personal use. The firm's stated assets under management of $50 million were actually closer to $8 million, and most of that was tied up in illiquid investments that couldn't be easily converted to cash. But the most devastating revelation concerned Aurora and Sebastian directly. Not only had Cordelia and Nathaniel opened credit cards in their children's names, but they had been systematically draining the college funds I had contributed to over the years.
The education accounts that should have contained nearly $300,000 from my gifts and their supposed matching contributions actually held less than $30,000. Mrs. Hawthorne, Marcus said when he called to deliver his preliminary findings, your daughter and son-in-law have been running what amounts to a long-term embezzlement operation against their own children. They've stolen money you intended for Aurora and Sebastian's education, damaged the kids' credit ratings, and put them in a position where they'll be financially handicapped before they even start their adult lives. The betrayal was so comprehensive that it took my breath away. Not only had they stolen 15 years of my relationship with my grandchildren, but they had been stealing from the grandchildren themselves, using money I had provided for Aurora and Sebastian's future to fund their own unsustainable lifestyle. There's more, Marcus continued grimly. They've also been forging documents related to the education accounts, creating fake statements showing higher balances than actually exist. If Aurora applies for financial aid based on these fraudulent numbers, they could face criminal charges for providing false information on federal forms. The scope of their deception was staggering. They weren't just bad with money, they were actively committing multiple forms of fraud, using their own children as both collateral and victims. Marcus's investigation also revealed the true desperation behind their recent visit to my penthouse. Nathaniel's business was going to be shut down within the next 30 days, unless he could produce the missing client funds immediately. The SEC investigation had frozen most of his remaining assets, and several clients had already filed lawsuits demanding restitution for their lost investments. Meanwhile, the foreclosure on their house would proceed to public auction in 6 weeks unless they could come up with $180,000 in back payments and fees. Their credit cards were maxed out, their personal accounts were overdrawn, and they had already borrowed against every possible asset, including life insurance policies on Aurora and Sebastian. They're not just asking you for college money, Marcus explained. They're asking you to save them from complete financial ruin and possible criminal prosecution. The $400,000 they requested would barely cover their immediate debts, let alone fund the children's education. As I absorbed this information, I felt a complex mixture of rage, sadness, and something that surprised me: relief. For 15 years, I had wondered if I was somehow at fault for the breakdown in our family relationships. I had questioned whether I really was too controlling, too demanding, too difficult to be around. Cordelia's criticisms of my behavior had planted seeds of self-doubt that had grown over the years of isolation and exclusion. But Marcus's investigation proved conclusively that their treatment of me had nothing to do with my personality or behavior. It had been about control, manipulation, and access to my money. They had spent 15 years systematically damaging my relationship with Aurora and Sebastian while simultaneously planning to exploit my wealth according to their timeline and needs. The grandmother they had portrayed as toxic and controlling had actually been the only responsible adult in the situation, while the parents they had presented as protective and caring had been stealing from their own children. While Marcus continued his financial investigation, I began reaching out to people in Aurora and Sebastian's lives to understand how much they knew about their true situation. This was delicate work. I didn't want to alarm them or create additional stress in their lives, but I needed to understand whether they were aware of their parents' financial crimes. My first contact was with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the college counselor at Aurora and Sebastian's private school, Westfield Academy. Dr. Walsh had been helping both twins with their college applications and financial aid paperwork, so she would have insight into their family's reported financial situation. After 15 years of being told I was too difficult for family gatherings, my daughter and son-in-law had the audacity to show up at my penthouse begging for money. They had no idea I'd been recording every cruel word they'd said about me over the years. The look on their faces when my lawyer played back their own voices in court was worth every lonely holiday I'd endured. Follow my story until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this reaches. At 70, I thought I understood what family loyalty meant. My name is Magdalena Hawthorne, and for 4 decades I had poured my heart, soul, and every waking moment into building Hawthorne Estates, a luxury real estate empire that spanned from the vineyards of Napa Valley to the coastal properties of Big Sur. My corner penthouse on the 42nd floor of the Millennium Tower in downtown San Francisco had been my sanctuary and my reward, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz Island gleaming in the distance, and the rolling fog that painted the bay in shades of silver and gold each morning. The penthouse wasn't just a home, it was a testament to what a woman could build when she refused to accept limitations. Every marble surface, every piece of custom furniture, every carefully curated art piece told the story of someone who had started with nothing and created something magnificent. The baccarat crystal chandelier in the foyer had been my gift to myself when Hawthorne Estates hit its first $100 million year. The Italian leather seating arrangement facing the windows was where I'd conducted some of my most important negotiations, the city sprawling below us as I closed deals that would shape San Francisco's skyline for decades. I hadn't inherited this life, I had built it, brick by brick, contract by contract, through 18-hour days and sleepless nights when others were home with their families. While other women my age had been attending PTA meetings and soccer games, I had been transforming abandoned warehouses into luxury condominiums, turning neglected neighborhoods into sought-after addresses, and creating homes for thousands of families across Northern California. The irony that haunted my quiet evenings was profound. I had spent my life creating beautiful homes for strangers, while struggling to maintain a place in my own family's heart. My daughter Cordelia had always been my greatest source of pride and my deepest source of heartache. Even as a child, she had possessed an ethereal beauty and a sharp intelligence that reminded me of myself at her age. But where I had channeled my intensity into building something lasting, Cordelia had directed hers toward perfection. Perfect grades, perfect appearance, perfect social connections, and eventually what she considered the perfect marriage. I had raised Cordelia largely alone after her father, my college sweetheart Marcus, died in a car accident when she was only 12. Marcus had been the gentle balance to my ambitious drive, the one who reminded me to slow down and notice the small moments. His death had left both Cordelia and me adrift, each of us grieving in our own way, while trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life. Perhaps that's where I made my first mistake. Drowning in grief and overwhelmed by single parenthood, I had thrown myself even deeper into my work. Hawthorne Estates became not just my career, but my escape, my way of avoiding the empty spaces in our house where Marcus's laughter used to echo. I told myself I was securing Cordelia's future, building something that would give her every opportunity I'd never had. But Cordelia saw only a mother who was physically present but emotionally unavailable, who could negotiate million-dollar deals but struggled to help with algebra homework without checking her phone. By the time I realized my mistake, Cordelia was already 17 and had learned to navigate life without expecting much emotional support from me. She was polite, accomplished, and increasingly distant. The perfect daughter on paper, but someone who felt more like a sophisticated roommate than my child. When Cordelia announced her engagement to Nathaniel Pemberton III at 26, I was genuinely thrilled. Nathaniel came from one of San Francisco's oldest families. His great-grandfather had made a fortune in shipping and railroads in the 1800s, and the Pemberton name was synonymous with philanthropy, culture, and old money elegance. More importantly, he seemed to worship Cordelia in a way that reminded me of how Marcus had looked at me in our early years. Nathaniel was everything I had hoped for in a son-in-law. Harvard-educated, articulate, professionally successful as a portfolio manager for high-net-worth clients, and genuinely kind to me during our initial interactions. He asked thoughtful questions about my business, expressed admiration for what I had built, and seemed to understand the demands and rewards of building wealth from nothing. Their wedding was a masterpiece of San Francisco society. 300 guests at the St. Francis Hotel with a reception that showcased the best of everything the city had to offer. I had insisted on paying for the entire celebration, partly because I could afford it, and partly because I wanted to give Cordelia the fairy tale wedding she had dreamed about since childhood. The event made the society pages of the Chronicle, with photographs of the bride looking radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown and the groom beaming beside her as they danced beneath chandeliers that cast rainbow light across the ballroom.
I thought about the question carefully, as I had been doing for days. Patricia, my relationship with them was severed 15 years ago when they decided I was too inconvenient to include in their lives. Everything that has happened since then has been their attempt to manipulate me for financial gain while maintaining that separation. I'm not destroying a loving family relationship, I'm exposing a fraudulent one. At exactly 9 a.m., Detective Sarah Rodriguez and Agent Michael Torres arrived, along with a third federal agent I hadn't met before, Agent Lisa Chen from the FBI's Organized Crime Division. The presence of an organized crime specialist initially surprised me, but Agent Torres explained that Nathaniel's securities fraud had connections to several other ongoing investigations into financial crimes networks operating throughout California. Mrs. Hawthorne, Detective Rodriguez said as we settled into my living room, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what's about to happen. Based on the evidence you've provided, we'll be executing search warrants on 3 properties: your daughter's house, your son-in-law's business offices, and a storage unit they've been renting under an assumed name. We'll also be freezing all of their bank accounts and seizing their vehicles and other major assets. Additionally, Agent Chen added, Nathaniel's cooperation with federal authorities could potentially reduce his sentence if he provides information about other individuals involved in similar schemes. But that cooperation would require him to admit to crimes that directly implicate your daughter as a co-conspirator. The implications were clear. Nathaniel might try to minimize his own culpability by emphasizing Cordelia's role in their crimes, potentially leading to more severe charges against my daughter. The thought of Cordelia facing additional prosecution because her husband was trying to save himself added another layer of complexity to an already devastating situation. What about Aurora and Sebastian? How will they be notified about what's happening? We've coordinated with their school. Dr. Walsh will call them out of classes at 10:15 a.m. and bring them to a private conference room. You'll meet with them there to explain the situation while we're processing their parents. Social services will be on standby, but since you've already filed for emergency guardianship, the children should be able to come home with you today. Patricia had prepared a detailed timeline for the day's events. At 10 a.m., I would call Cordelia to deliver what she expected to be my decision about their financial request. While we were talking, law enforcement would arrive at their house with arrest and search warrants. At 10:15 a.m., Aurora and Sebastian would be called out of classes and brought to meet with me. By noon, Cordelia and Nathaniel would be booked and processed, and I would hopefully be driving my grandchildren to my penthouse to begin the difficult process of rebuilding our family relationships. As 10 a.m. approached, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the family relationships that were about to be destroyed, anger at the crimes that had necessitated these drastic actions, and determination to protect Aurora and Sebastian from any further harm. The woman who had been excluded from family holidays for 15 years was about to become the only stable family member in my grandchildren's lives. At exactly 10 a.m., I dialed Cordelia's number while Detective Rodriguez listened on an extension and Agent Torres prepared to signal the arrest teams. Cordelia answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the kind of artificial enthusiasm she had perfected over years of social climbing. Mom, I was hoping you'd call today. Nathaniel and I have been so anxious to hear your decision. Have you had a chance to think about our conversation? Yes, Cordelia, I have. I've given your request very careful consideration, and I've consulted with several advisors about the best course of action. Advisors? There was a slight note of concern in her voice. What kind of advisors? Financial advisors, legal advisors, and law enforcement advisors, I replied calmly. It turns out
that when you investigate a request for $400,000, you discover quite a lot of interesting information. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. When Cordelia spoke again, her voice had changed. The artificial brightness was gone, replaced by something more cautious and calculating. I don't understand what you mean by law enforcement advisors. This is a family financial matter. Actually, Cordelia, this stopped being a family matter when you and Nathaniel began committing felonies against your own children. Identity theft, embezzlement, fraud. These are criminal matters that require criminal justice responses. I could hear her sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of movement, probably her getting up from wherever she had been sitting when I called. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I know about the college funds you've embezzled. I interrupted, my voice steady and authoritative. The accounts that should contain nearly $300,000 from my contributions and your supposed matching funds actually contain less than $30,000. We had to make some temporary withdrawals, but we always intended to pay that money back.
I know about the credit cards you opened in Aurora and Sebastian's names, destroying their credit before they even became adults. I know about the life insurance policies you took out on them and the loans you secured against those policies. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear whispering in the background, probably Cordelia calling for Nathaniel. I know about Nathaniel's Ponzi scheme and the SEC investigation into Pemberton Wealth Advisors. I know about the client funds he embezzled and the fake returns he provided to hide his theft. You don't understand the complexities of investment management, Cordelia said defensively, but her voice was shaking now. I know about your house being in foreclosure and about you selling Aurora and Sebastian's personal belongings, including jewelry I gave them, to generate cash for your other expenses. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if she had hung up. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was barely above a whisper. How do you know all of that? Because, Cordelia, while you've been spending 15 years convincing everyone that your mother was too difficult to include in family gatherings, your mother has been documenting every conversation, investigating every financial transaction, and building a comprehensive case that will send both you and Nathaniel to federal prison. I could hear what sounded like a chair scraping across the floor, followed by rapid footsteps. Nathaniel! Cordelia called out, her voice muffled as if she had moved away from the phone. Nathaniel, get in here! We have a serious problem! When she returned to the phone, her voice was frantic, desperate in a way I had never heard before. Mom, whatever you think you know, we can explain everything. Yes, we've had some financial difficulties, but we've never intentionally... The sound of loud, authoritative knocking interrupted her mid-sentence. I could hear voices in the background, official voices announcing themselves as law enforcement officers with warrants for search and arrest. Mom, Cordelia whispered into the phone, her voice filled with a terror that was painful to hear, despite everything she had done to her own children. What have you done? I've protected my grandchildren from parents who were willing to destroy their futures to maintain their own lifestyle, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. And I've ensured that Aurora and Sebastian will finally learn the truth about why their grandmother was kept out of their lives for 15 years. I could hear more voices now, Nathaniel shouting something about lawyers, Cordelia crying, official commands being given by law enforcement officers. The sound of my daughter's distress was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to remember the evidence of what she had done to her own children, the years of lies and theft that had brought us to this moment. Please, Mom, Cordelia begged, don't do this to us. Don't do this to Aurora and Sebastian. They need their parents. They need parents who won't steal from them. They need parents who won't destroy their credit and sell their belongings. They need parents who won't keep them away from loving family members. Since you and Nathaniel have proven incapable of being those kinds of parents, someone else needs to step in. The phone went dead as law enforcement took control of the situation. I sat back in my chair, feeling a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Detective Rodriguez confirmed through her radio that both Cordelia and Nathaniel had been arrested without resistance and were being transported to federal detention facilities for processing. Within minutes, I received updates about the search warrants being executed. The storage unit that Marcus had discovered contained boxes of forged financial documents, fake identity materials, and what appeared to be preparation for a potential flight from the country. Agent Chen's suspicions about organized crime connections were proving accurate. Cordelia and Nathaniel hadn't just been stealing from their family and clients, they had been preparing to disappear entirely if their crimes were discovered. At 10:30 a.m., I arrived at Westfield Academy to meet with Aurora and Sebastian. Dr. Walsh had prepared a comfortable conference room where we could speak privately, and she had arranged for the school's counseling staff to be available if needed. The drive from my penthouse to their school had given me time to prepare mentally for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. When Aurora and Sebastian entered the conference room, I was struck by how much they had grown since our last supervised visit nearly a year earlier. Aurora had inherited her mother's ethereal beauty, but carried herself with a confidence and maturity that reminded me of myself at her age. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the kind of understated but expensive clothes that suggested good taste and financial comfort. Clothes that I now knew were being purchased with money stolen from their education funds.
I know about the credit cards you opened in Aurora and Sebastian's names, destroying their credit before they even became adults. I know about the life insurance policies you took out on them and the loans you secured against those policies. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear whispering in the background, probably Cordelia calling for Nathaniel. I know about Nathaniel's Ponzi scheme and the SEC investigation into Pemberton Wealth Advisors. I know about the client funds he embezzled and the fake returns he provided to hide his theft. You don't understand the complexities of investment management, Cordelia said defensively, but her voice was shaking now. I know about your house being in foreclosure, and about you selling Aurora and Sebastian's personal belongings, including jewelry I gave them, to generate cash for your other expenses. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if she had hung up. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was barely above a whisper. How do you know all of that? Because, Cordelia, while you've been spending 15 years convincing everyone that your mother was too difficult to include in family gatherings, your mother has been documenting every conversation, investigating every financial transaction, and building a comprehensive case that will send both you and Nathaniel to federal prison. I could hear what sounded like a chair scraping across the floor, followed by rapid footsteps. Nathaniel! Cordelia called out, her voice muffled as if she had moved away from the phone. Nathaniel, get in here! We have a serious problem! When she returned to the phone, her voice was frantic, desperate in a way I had never heard before. Mom, whatever you think you know, we can explain everything. Yes, we've had some financial difficulties, but we've never intentionally... The sound of loud, authoritative knocking interrupted her mid-sentence. I could hear voices in the background, official voices announcing themselves as law enforcement officers with warrants for search and arrest. Mom, Cordelia whispered into the phone, her voice filled with a terror that was painful to hear, despite everything she had done to her own children. What have you done? I've protected my grandchildren from parents who were willing to destroy their futures to maintain their own lifestyle, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. And I've ensured that Aurora and Sebastian will finally learn the truth about why their grandmother was kept out of their lives for 15 years. I could hear more voices now, Nathaniel shouting something about lawyers, Cordelia crying, official commands being given by law enforcement officers. The sound of my daughter's distress was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to remember the evidence of what she had done to her own children, the years of lies and theft that had brought us to this moment. Please, Mom, Cordelia begged, don't do this to us. Don't do this to Aurora and Sebastian. They need their parents. They need parents who won't steal from them. They need parents who won't destroy their credit and sell their belongings. They need parents who won't keep them away from loving family members. Since you and Nathaniel have proven incapable of being those kinds of parents, someone else needs to step in. The phone went dead as law enforcement took control of the situation. I sat back in my chair, feeling a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Detective Rodriguez confirmed through her radio that both Cordelia and Nathaniel had been arrested without resistance and were being transported to federal detention facilities for processing. Within minutes, I received updates about the search warrants being executed. The storage unit that Marcus had discovered contained boxes of forged financial documents, fake identity materials, and what appeared to be preparation for a potential flight from the country. Agent Chen's suspicions about organized crime connections were proving accurate.
Cordelia and Nathaniel hadn't just been stealing from their family and clients, they had been preparing to disappear entirely if their crimes were discovered. At 10:30 a.m., I arrived at Westfield Academy to meet with Aurora and Sebastian. Dr. Walsh had prepared a comfortable conference room where we could speak privately, and she had arranged for the school's counseling staff to be available if needed. The drive from my penthouse to their school had given me time to prepare mentally for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. When Aurora and Sebastian entered the conference room, I was struck by how much they had grown since our last supervised visit nearly a year earlier. Aurora had inherited her mother's ethereal beauty, but carried herself with a confidence and maturity that reminded me of myself at her age. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the kind of understated but expensive clothes that suggested good taste and financial comfort. Clothes that I now knew were being purchased with money stolen from their education funds.
Sebastian had grown tall and lanky, with Marcus's thoughtful dark eyes and my own determined jaw. He moved with the easy confidence of a successful student and natural leader, but I could see tension in his shoulders and wariness in his expression that suggested he sensed something serious was happening. "Grandma?" Aurora said uncertainly as they took seats across from me, clearly confused by my unexpected presence at their school. "What's going on?" "Dr. Walsh said there was a family emergency, but she wouldn't give us any details." "Please, sit down and make yourself comfortable," I said gently, gesturing to the chairs across from mine. "There are some very important things you need to know about your parents and about why I've been largely absent from your lives." What followed was one of the most emotionally challenging conversations I had ever had. Speaking slowly and carefully, I explained that their parents had been arrested for financial crimes that directly affected them. I told them about the stolen college funds, the damaged credit, the fraudulent use of their identities, and the years of deception that had hidden the true state of their family's finances. Sebastian was the first to speak, his voice hollow with shock and disbelief. "Are you saying that our parents have been stealing money that was meant for us?" "Yes," I replied gently. "Money that I had contributed to your education funds over the years, and money that should have been saved from other sources as well. The college funds that your parents claimed contained over $200,000 actually hold less than $30,000. Aurora's response was more complex, her face cycling through expressions of confusion, anger, and a deep hurt that went beyond simple financial betrayal. "And they kept us away from us because they were afraid you would discover what they were doing?" "That appears to be a significant part of it. For 15 years, they told everyone, including you, that I was too controlling and difficult to be around. But the evidence suggests that they were primarily concerned about maintaining control over information about your finances and your future." I spent the next hour answering their questions as honestly and carefully as I could. I showed them copies of some of the evidence that had been gathered, explaining the legal process that would unfold over the coming months, and helping them understand the immediate practical implications of their parents' arrest. Both Sebastian and Aurora demonstrated remarkable maturity in their responses, asking thoughtful questions about their immediate future and the long-term consequences of their parents' actions. Aurora wanted to understand how this would affect her acceptance to Stanford and whether she would still be able to attend college in the fall. Sebastian was concerned about their housing situation and what would happen to their belongings in their parents' house. "What happens to us now?" Sebastian asked, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly. "Where do we live? How do we pay for college? What about all our plans?" "That's what we need to figure out together. I've petitioned the court to become your legal guardian, which would give me the authority to help you navigate the situation and plan for your futures. But that arrangement only works if you're comfortable with it, if you're willing to trust me to act in your best interests." Sebastian and Aurora exchanged one of those silent communications that twins sometimes share.
a look that conveyed volumes of unspoken conversation. Finally, Aurora spoke for both of them. "Grandma, we don't really know you very well because our parents kept us apart for most of our lives. But right now, you're the only adult in our family who seems to be telling us the truth and looking out for our interests. If you're willing to help us get through this, we'd like to try to build a real relationship with you." The emotions that flooded through me at that moment were almost overwhelming. After 15 years of systematic exclusion and manipulation, my grandchildren were choosing to trust me with their futures. It was both a tremendous honor and an enormous responsibility. That afternoon, Aurora and Sebastian came home with me to my penthouse. They stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Golden Gate Bridge and the bay beyond, while I showed them to the guest rooms that would become their new bedrooms. The space that had been so empty for so many years was suddenly filled with the voices and energy of young adults beginning to process the most traumatic experience of their lives. Over the following weeks, we began the difficult work of understanding and addressing the damage their parents had done. Aurora threw herself into researching financial aid options and scholarship opportunities, determined to not let her parents' crimes derail her educational plans. Her strength and resilience reminded me of myself at her age, facing obstacles that seemed insurmountable, but refusing to be defeated by circumstances beyond her control. Sebastian channeled his anger and hurt into understanding the legal process, attending meetings with attorneys and federal agents, asking detailed questions about the charges against his parents and the timeline for prosecution. His analytical approach to processing trauma impressed everyone who worked with him, and his determination to ensure that justice was served showed a maturity that belied his 18 years.
The legal proceedings against Cordelia and Nathaniel unfolded over the following months. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and faced with the prospect of lengthy prison sentences if they went to trial, both eventually accepted plea bargains. The storage unit searches had revealed the full extent of their criminal network, connecting them to other fraudulent schemes that resulted in additional charges. Cordelia ultimately received 4 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Nathaniel was sentenced to 7 years due to the scope of his securities fraud and his connections to organized financial crime networks. Both were required to make full restitution to their victims, though since most of their assets had been seized or liquidated, the actual financial recovery was minimal. The house in Pacific Heights was sold at auction to satisfy the mortgage and other debts. Aurora and Sebastian were allowed to retrieve their personal belongings, but they discovered that many items with sentimental value had indeed been sold by their parents during their desperate final months. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire process was helping Aurora and Sebastian understand and process the emotional betrayal they had experienced. Counseling sessions with Dr. Elena Martinez helped us all navigate the complex feelings of loss, anger, and grief that came with rebuilding relationships while processing the destruction of others. But gradually, over months of shared experiences and honest conversations, Aurora and Sebastian and I began to develop the kind of relationships I had always hoped we could have. We celebrated Aurora's successful financial aid applications together, working late into the evening to complete scholarship essays and FAFSA forms. We attended Sebastian's high school graduation ceremony, sitting in the front row as he delivered a powerful valedictorian speech about resilience and choosing your own family. Most meaningfully, we celebrated our first real holiday together, Thanksgiving 2025, exactly 16 years after I had been excluded from their family celebrations. Aurora and Sebastian helped me prepare dinner in my penthouse kitchen, and we ate while watching the Golden Gate Bridge paint in shades of gold and crimson. "Grandma," Aurora said as we cleared the dishes, "I want you to know that we're grateful for what you did. It was brave and it was right, even though it must have been incredibly difficult." Today, Aurora is thriving at Stanford, studying international relations with a focus on financial crime prevention. Sebastian is in his freshman year at UC Berkeley, majoring in environmental engineering while volunteering with organizations that help young people who have been victims of financial abuse. The woman who was told she was too difficult for family gatherings discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal comes at tremendous personal cost. Real family relationships are built on truth, respect, and genuine care, not manipulation, control, and financial exploitation. The judge had other plans for my estate and my family. Plans that included justice, consequences, and the opportunity for authentic relationships built on honesty rather than lies. Comment what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Remember, you're never too old to stand up for what's right.